We should herein conclude Philopoemen from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. From thence he immediately led out the horse, the noblest of the city, young men in the vigor of their age and eager to proffer their service, both from attachment to Philopoemen and zeal for the cause. As they marched towards Messene, they met with Dinocrates near the hill of Evander, charged and routed him. But 500 fresh men, who being left for a guard in the country, came in late, happening to appear, the flying enemy rallied again about the hills. Philopoemen, fearing to be enclosed and solicitous for his men, retreated over ground extremely disadvantageous, bringing up the rear himself. As he often faced and made charges upon the enemy, he drew them upon himself, though they merely made movements at a distance, and shouted about him, nobody daring to approach him. In his care to save every single man, he left his main body so often that at last he found himself alone among the thickest of his enemies. Yet even then none durst come up to him, but being pelted at a distance, and driven to stony, steep places, he had great difficulty, with much spurring, to guide his horse aright. His age was no hindrance to him, for with perpetual exercise it was both strong and active, but being weakened with sickness and tired with his long journey, his horse stumbling, he felt encumbered with his arms and faint upon a hard and rugged piece of ground. His head received such a shock with the fall that he lay a while speechless, so that the enemy, thinking him dead, began to turn and strip him. But when they saw him lift his head and open his eyes, they threw themselves all together upon him, bound his hands behind him, and carried him off. Every kind of insult and continually being lavished on him, who truly had never so much dreamed of being led in triumph by Dinocrates. The Athenians, wonderfully elated with the news, thronged in swarms to the city gates, but when they saw Philopoemen in a posture so unsuitable to the glory of his great actions and famous victories, most of them struck with grief and cursing the deceitful vanity of human fortune, even shed tears of compassion at the spectacle. Such tears by little and little turned to kind words, and it was almost in everybody's mouth that they ought to remember what he had done for them, and how he had preserved the common liberty by driving away nabis some few to make their court to Dinocrates, or for torturing and then putting him to death as a dangerous and irreconcilable enemy, all the more formidable to Dinocrates, who had taken him as a prisoner. Should he after this misfortune regain his liberty, they put him at last into a dungeon underground, which they called the Treasury, a place into which there came no air nor light from abroad, and which, having no doors, was closed with a great stone. And whether prisoners or captives or whatever, there's torturing people and degrading people that should not be part of it, right? This they rolled into the entrance and fixed, and placing a guard about it, left him in the meantime. Philopoemen's soldiers recovering themselves after their flight, and fearing he was dead when he appeared nowhere, made a stand, calling him with loud cries, and reproaching one another with their unworthy and shameful escape, having betrayed their general, who, to preserve their lives, had lost his own. Then, returning after much inquiry and search, hearing at last that he was taken, then they sent away messengers round about with the news. The Achaeans resented the misfortune deeply, and decreed to send and demand him, and in the meantime drew their army together for their rescue. When these things passed in Achaia, Dinocrates, fearing that any delay would save Philopoemen, and resolving to be beforehand with the Achaeans, as soon as night had dispersed the multitude, sent in the executioner with poison, with orders not to stir from him till he had taken it. Philopoemen had then laid down, wrapped in his cloak, not sleeping, but oppressed with grief and trouble, but seeing light and a man with poison by him, struggled to sit up, and taking the cup, asked the man if he had heard anything of the horsemen, particularly Lycortas. The fellow answered, the most part. He had got off safe. He nodded, and looking cheerfully upon him, it is well, he said, that we have not been every way unfortunate, and without a word more, drank it off, and laid him down again, his weakness offering but little resistance to the poison. It dispatched him presently. The news of his death filled all Achaia with grief and lamentation. The youth, with some of the chief of the several cities, met at Megalopolis with a resolution to take revenge without delay. They chose Lycortas, general, and falling upon the Messenians, put all to fire and sword, till they all, with one consent, made their submission. Dinocrates, with as many as had voted for Philopoemen's death, anticipated their vengeance and killed themselves. Well, with all this stuff going back and forth, yeah, people expect the same sort of things done to them. But generally in mythology, suicide is repeated upon the person who commits suicide over and over again. Or at least they go to some sort of hell realm or something as a result. Those who would have him tortured, Lycortas put in chains and reserved for severe punishment. They burnt his body and put the ashes into an urn, and then marched homeward, not as in an ordinary march, but with a kind of solemn pomp, half triumph, half funeral, crowns of victory on their heads, and tears in their eyes, and their captive enemies in fetters by them. Polybius, the general's son, carried the urn so covered with garlands and ribbons as scarcely to be visible, and the noblest of the Achaeans accompanied him. The soldiers followed, fully armed and mounted, with looks neither altogether sad as in mourning, nor lofty as in victory. The people from all towns and villages, in their way, flocked out to meet him as at his return from conquest, and saluting the urn, fell in with the company and followed on to Megalopolis, where the old men, the women, and the children were mingled with the rest. The whole city was filled with sighs, complaints, and cries, the loss of Philopoemen seeming to them the loss of their own greatness, and of their rank among the Achaeans. Thus he was honorably buried according to his worth, and the prisoners were stoned about his tomb. Many statues were set up, and many honors decreed to him by the several cities. One of the Romans, in the time of Greece's affliction, after the destruction of Corinth, publicly accusing Philopoemen as if he had been still alive, and having been the enemy of Rome, proposed that these memorials should be all removed. A discussion ensued, speeches were made, and Polybius answered the sycophant at large, and neither Mummius nor the lieutenants would suffer the honorable monuments of so great a man to be defaced, though he had often crossed both Titus and Manius. They justly distinguished at and as became honest men betwixt usefulness and virtue, what is good in itself and what is profitable to particular parties, judging thanks and reward due to him who does a benefit from him who receives it, and honor never to be denied by good to the good. And so much concerning Philopoemen. Now, a side note of something that relates to that, that's in Islam, for example, when they gain control over an area, if there's a place of worship that's no longer used, okay, fine, they remove the idols. But even in the Muslim world, where people pray at shrines and do other things, either deviate from Islam or fully take them out of Islam, these shrines are not taken down. They're not, whatever. The Islamic State has no right to remove them. Even Hanbali agreed with this, that, hey, leave their shrines alone. Islam may not promote that, but yeah, leave their shrines alone. And we find much better preserved than in Europe. Well, some of it's weather, and not all the Middle East is desert, by the way, but, pre-Quranic, pre-even Jewish shrines out there in the desert. But yeah, if people aren't, people should have the freedom. Hey, we don't use these idols and stuff like this anymore. We destroy them. But only as far as the masjid is that ever something per se encouraged, because the people, the minorities that still exist, they have their rights to their worship places, and that's how it should be. Oh, it's fallen out of favor, let's get rid of these old statues. It's like, no, it reminds of history in my country. There's been a lot of that too. I've visited graveyards where people tear down the thing. Oh, that was probably a white guy who existed before, who died before the Civil Rights Act. It's like, yeah, even if the person actually was known to have done something wrong in that respect, wouldn't it be better to leave the history so we can look at it and say, and perhaps carry on the benefit of, rather than, the bad issue or something. I mean, there's a lot of things attached to this, but yeah, I'm not iconoclast, and not promoting that.